Welcome to week 2 of the membership classes. So this morning we'll focus on the history of our church, where we as a church came from. Now I'm a firm believer, the fruits are part of the roots. So if the roots are bad, there will be bad fruit. But fortunately our church has very, very strong roots, which are very good. So the Restoration movement was historically known as the Stone Campbell Restoration Movement. And this arose in the USA. Now, the two leading figures of this movement was Barton W. Stone and Alexander Campbell. Thus, it's often referred to as the Stone Campbell Restoration Movement. Now, the Restoration Movement led to 3 modern-day American religious groups that trace their heritage back to this specific Restoration Movement. So we have the Christian Church, also known as the Disciples of Christ. Then there's also the Church of Christ, and there's also the independent churches or the churches of Christ. Now, various people from different denominations, such as the Methodists, the Baptists, and the Presbyterians, then abandoned their denominations and their denominational views because they had the hopes of establishing a church that is based solely on the Christianity as it was taught in the New Testament. So they wanted to go back to what the church was in the book of Acts, as it was established by Jesus Christ himself. So they had, as their belief, Jesus as the only model and the Bible as the only sacred book. We know this as sola scriptura, Bible only. The only authority is the Bible. So they endeavored to re-establish Christ's church as it had been when Jesus himself established the church. That is what they wanted. They wanted the first century church back in modern society. That's why they called it the Restoration Movement, to restore the modern day church back to what it should be, how it should be, and how it should be governed. So they firmly believe that different denominations had constructed rules and also practices that did not explicitly come from the Bible. So they wanted to get rid of all the man-made rules and traditions and just enforce what was in the Bible. So they wanted everyone to abandon their denominational views and become united as one church under God's rule. That was their mission, is to get everyone established under one church under God's rule. Jesus as the head, no one else, nothing else. Sounds very congregational, right? So you can see where we get our roots. So, of particular importance to them was the recognition of the New Testament pattern of church with respect to a weekly celebration of the Lord's Supper, the rejection of unbiblical names, creeds, and ecclesiastical traditions. So in other words, the hierarchies and stuff that were invented, they didn't want it. They wanted only what the Bible taught. And all of these matters has contributed, as you can imagine, to a lot of division amongst various denominations and people. Okay, but their key principle as the Restoration Movement was actually unity. But you know, the moment you actually start sharing truth and spreading truth, it will divide. Truth will divide. You will never find truth not dividing. It will always divide. You see, at the start then of the 20th century, the American missionaries of the Churches of Christ then started arriving in South Africa, with the particular mission of restoring a divided and what they called an apostate Christendom to the New Testament church. As I said, the first century church. They believe the church had become apostate because they have drifted away from what Jesus taught and made it a more man-made building and man-made traditions instead of focusing on Christ and His Word. So, the first lasting work of this movement in our country came in the form of the Woburn Avenue Church, which was established in 1901, and it had a very successful ministry up until 1989, when the church disbanded and all the assets were sold to the Presbyterian Church. Now, it was also during the 1920s, and this is a very important time period for our specific church, because it is during the 1920s that the American missionaries, who were now affiliated with the United Christian Missionary Society, started having Bible studies and prayer meetings in different town halls all throughout the East Rand. So they started small. They had it in all these town halls and wherever they could find a space to start having these gatherings. Okay? And it is then the UCMS's field secretary, Reverend Dr. Basil Holt, who then remained behind in our country. And he established what was known as the Benoni Church of Christ in 1927. That is our church, which was then established in Woburn Avenue, there in town. And some people say Woburn Avenue could actually that time have been called Church Street, because it was our church, the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, the Baptist Church, all in that same street, all next to each other. So people say it could have actually been called Church Street. But that is where we started, 1927, in Woburn Avenue as Benoni Church of Christ. Then as time progressed, there were 5 churches established as part of the Church of Christ denomination. So it was the Linden Avenue Church, the Primrose Church, our church, the Benoni Church, the Brakpan Church, and also the Boksburg Church. And for a period after Reverend Dr. Basil Holt left the congregation, they were reliant upon the services of traveling preachers. Okay, so they had to rely on the services of people to come in and preach. So they didn't have a full-time minister at all times. Okay. Then a new minister was appointed in 1949. That was Reverend Divenage, and under his leadership, the church facilities in Woburn Avenue actually became too small to house everyone that now came to the church. Thus, the UCMS started building the church here in Farrarmere. So that's where we are today, 32 Main Road. And they started this in 1949, as it was now too small in Woburn Avenue that our church had to move this side. So the new church then was officially opened 1957. That is when our church, as we know it today, opened. Then we were known as the Farrarmere Christian Church. Okay, and it was actually opened by the Prime Minister in that time of what we knew back then as Rhodesia, Zimbabwe today, for those of you who don't study history. That was Sir Garfield Todd. Okay. Now unfortunately, this led to a major split within our church, because there were families and members who now objected against the change of the church's name, as well as the fact that the church was playing music during praise and worship, and thus the Farrarmere Church of Christ was established, which is still ministering up to this day. So there was a split. You had our church and you had their church, which still exists to this day. Now, Reverend Divenage died shortly after this. There are actually some people who believe that he died as a result of a broken heart, due to the fact that his own family also split during that time because of the split that occurred. Then Reverend Al Horn became our church's full-time minister, but the disciples of Christ, under whom the church was now being governed, could not provide a minister at that stage. However, the congregation persevered and once again then had to rely upon the services of traveling preachers. Then in 1972, the disciples of Christ withdrew from our country, okay, along with all their congregations. And now they were integrated into the United Congregational Churches of South Africa, which are also known as ACSA. So ACSA also had the vision of uniting all churches under one, and those original, as the original restorationists intended. That is what they also wanted. However, the Primrose Congregation was also disbanded, and the property was sold. The Boksburg Church building was expropriated. It was currently where the Civic Center is located, so that used to be one of our churches. And then the Brakpan Congregation also joined ACSA shortly after this. And it was in this point in time that FCC went on their own and then became a non-denominational independent church. However, they were still actively searching for a denomination that supported and allowed believers' baptism. In other words, adult baptism or credo baptism, because that is what they firmly held to as a belief. There has to be belief before you are baptized. But they couldn't find any such denominations at that stage. Another challenge that was faced was that of finding and appointing a full-time minister. Therefore, traveling and visiting preachers were used to preach the Sunday services, as well as one of the eldest members of the church's father, Mr. Alf Moffat, who also stepped up and fulfilled that role of being a preacher. Then FCC realized that they could not keep up with that trend and that they actually needed to now belong to a denomination in order to have fellowship with them, as well as a sense of belonging. And this is when they approached ACSA, who were then willing to allow FCC to conduct both child baptisms as well as believers' baptisms. So with this allowance, FCC then changed their name to Farrarmere Congregational church. Now, 3 of the families from the disbanded Boksburg congregation joined in worship at the renamed FCC. A member of the Boksburg congregation named Monty Neweth then approached AXA to inquire as to the whereabouts of the money that was in the Boksburg congregation's bank account. AXA was holding it in a trust and was generous in providing it to us, and with all that money, we built the hall. So with that money, we were able to build the church hall. And Gary McLean's father actually drew up the plans for us to be able to build that church hall. And then also he drew up the plans for a property that is currently being used as the church's manse, which we are currently renting out. That is now 1977. And then we were provided with a full-time minister in 1977 as well, Reverend Robin Thompson. So Reverend Thompson was a minister while the hall was being built. It was also his wife who started the SCA at Tom Newby during that time. So she started the Student Christian Association during that time. Then after the purchase of the manse was established, there were 2 members from the Boksburg congregation, 2 members from Buckburn, and 2 members from Farrarmere. So we called it the East Rand Property Trust. The trust had complete oversight in the East Rand with regard to all the ministerial aspects. All the members on the trust contributed monthly, and from these contributions, they were able to then pay the minister's stipend, medical aid, etc. Then Reverend Thompson made the decision to return to Durban, and he was replaced by Minister Tinus Nienaber. Under his leadership, the Brockman congregation was sold, and FCC then changed the name to St. John's Congregational Church. So we were then known as St. John's Congregational Church. He eventually left for an AXA church in Pretoria and was replaced by Minister Craig Morrison. Unfortunately, Minister Craig took over leadership of what some people may have termed some nasty things back then, but the church, regardless of dire financial straits, etc., and few people attending, continued and remained strong. So St. John's Church was unable to necessarily pay him, which then eventually led him to find a paying job and leaving the church shortly afterwards. After he left, the church then started renting out the manse. Then Mr. Haynes became the chairman of the deacons. Alfie Moffat took over as a treasurer. And then at this point in time, the church was faced with a 30,000 Rand overdraft, as well as owing 20,000 Rand to AXA. And yet the church did not have the finances to cover these responsibilities, had to revert back to making use of traveling preachers again in order to conduct the Sunday services. Then Alf Cunningham, who was a Methodist preacher, started preaching at the church on a regular basis, even though he was a minister for the Terfontein Congregational Church. The Terfontein Congregational Church would eventually leave AXA and become an affiliate of the Evangelical Fellowship of Congregational Churches of South Africa, the EFCCSA. This caused AXA to be unwilling to appoint him as a full-time minister to this church, and they appointed Minister Nienaber again to conduct evening services for our church. The church then took the drastic steps to disband from AXA and also join the EFCCSA to avoid shutting its doors permanently. Then Reverend Alf Cunningham was free to now lead the church. He was replaced by Reverend Jenny Fernandez at Terfontein Congregational Church, and then our church took back the name Farrarmere Congregational Church. And then when Reverend Cunningham was nearing retirement, he mentioned it to Sandra Pillay, who is the wife of Reverend Dr. Jerry Pillay, and he then took over as the minister of our church. So he was a minister of the church until 2020, when he then was replaced by Reverend Lincoln. Unfortunately, Lincoln could not lead the church for a full year before he sadly passed away. The church was then left again with no other option but to get in traveling preachers again. And then that was the point when I was fortunate enough to be invited to become the minister at Farrarmere Congregational Church. So you can see, even though there may have been struggles and difficulties and so forth within our history, the church remains strong, because it is not up to us, but it is God. Even when you read Acts, we can take hope in the fact that it is not us that add to the numbers daily, but God who adds to the numbers daily. And it is God who kept us here and alive and going and strong. So we just keep our reliance on God. So our roots are actually very strong. We have the same motivation still today to live out the earliest churches' ways and do things the way they did, and follow Christ the way they did, and keep our focus on Him and live according to His word, without giving headship to any man or person, because the only head of our church is Jesus. So I do believe we have very, very strong roots historically. We've been here since 1927. You'll see we have the slogan, impacting lives. So for almost 100 years in Benoni, most people already passing through Benoni have at some stage or another been through our church. So we have greatly impacted Benoni in some way or another. And I believe we will continue to do so and continue to build an even brighter future, which will one day be our history, which people will then also be talking about in maybe 100 or 200 years. Maybe. But I do believe our roots are strong, our fruits are growing, and I believe we have an awesome future ahead. That is my belief. That is where we came from. And it's important to know where we came from, because a church that doesn't know where they came from will have no idea where they're going. And that's where we come to now. When we think of where it is that we are actually currently. So, only thing I can say, in the words of how Americans would say, so here's the deal. FCC is all about Jesus. That is what we are about. Jesus plus nothing. Okay? We don't add anything, we don't bring anything in. It is Jesus plus nothing. Okay? We're a family of individuals. We found our hope in Jesus, and that's simply put, what we want to do is to have as many people as possible experience the exact same freedom in their faith as what we do. Okay, we're also affiliated to the AFC-CSA, as I've mentioned. I've told you about our history. So where I believe we are headed is that we must leave those things that we consider to be our most precious things behind and place all our focus and trust in Jesus Christ. So anything earthly, worldly, material, possessions does not matter in the great scheme of things. As a church, we leave all that behind and we place our focus squarely on Jesus. So we're committed to fostering a community that loves, worships, honors, glorifies, and praises Jesus Christ as the King of Kings. And we follow Him regardless of the cost, without any second thoughts, to walk according to His way. So now what this means for you is, most importantly, you're always welcome at the FCC. Always welcome at FCC. We have a seat for you. Whenever you are in your faith journey specifically, you'll always be accepted as a part of the Farrarmere family. And beyond that, we are here to strengthen, to encourage, and to help you grow and mature in your faith. We are more than just a building. We are actually a church family, a Christian community that help each other. And that is, I believe, where we are headed. And you are and will be, as members, part of that vision and picture to help us move the church in that direction. That is week 2. Week 3, we'll continue again.